The main focus of our discussion today will be halachic discussions relevant to what's going on in contemporary life. But first, I want to introduce a few hashkafic ideas, some of which are very personal, and I wanted to share them with you. One is about tefillah b'yachid. Now, I don't know how many of you are still davening alone. Here in our neck of the woods in Yerushalayim HaKodesh, the shuls are not yet open. There are minyanim going outside here and there in the streets, but it's not exactly the same. And I'm always looking for sort of like a pump for tefillah b'yachid. Something that could perhaps give us a little bit more meaning to our tefillos. And I want to begin today with something that I saw in a sefer called Yurei Harav. I'll just show you what the sefer looks like. Got a brown cover. I don't know if you can see it. And it's an anthology of some of the insights of my Rebbe Rav Soloveitchik to tefillah, to brachos, to Birchas HaTorah specifically, Kriyat Shema, and so forth. It's authored by Harav Menachem Kanak, based on various public shiurim that the Rav gave. And if anyone's interested, I am going to quote now from page 211. And he writes that Shachris is made up of three Kedushos. One of the major chunks of davening that's missing these days is Kedusha, because the halacha is Ein Davar Shebekadusha Pachos Me'asara. And in the absence of a minyan, last week we discussed the possibility of having minyanim on porches and who sees whom, and do you see the shots and so forth. I'm not going to go over that again. That was last week's discussion. But assuming you're davening alone and you're missing Kedusha, but there are three Kedushos to Shmon Esrei, to Shachris. The first he called Kedushas Yotzer, which is incorporated into the Birchas Kriyat Shema. The second is Kedushas HaMidah, which is recited by the Shliach Tzibur, initiating in the framework of Chazar Sashas. The third is Kedusha de Sidra, and that's the Kedusha that we recite in Uval Tzion. And Rav Soloveitchik tries to understand the various component parts that make up this whole called Gimel Kedushos. And he says the following, that if you read carefully, and again, there's a whole shir on this topic, which I'm not going to go into now, I just want to give you from the top. If you go through carefully, Kedushas Yotzer, in Birchas Kriyat Shema, in Shachris, you will see that fundamentally it's Shiras HaMalachim. It's the Shira of the angels, who have a very keen perspective on the Almighty, on divinity, up in Shamayim. And Chazal understand that when we recite the Shiras HaMalachim, we can link up B'shas Tefillah, when we recite Kedusha, to the Kedusha of the Malachim. And we recite the following, that just like the Malachim up in Shamayim can recite Kedusha, so too we can imitate the Malachim, and in a sense, in the Rav's language, litztaref aleim, to integrate together with them in this experience of reciting Shira. Kedushas HaMidah, on the other hand, is fundamentally, in the Rav's language, tziruf shel Kedushos Yisrael. These are all the people of Israel gathering together and meshing into one entity. And that is a Kedusha in which the Malachim are sort of left out, and the people of Israel as an entity, as a tzibur, will recite the Kedusha, the song to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Kedusha de Sidra, the third Kedusha, which is integrated into Volet Zion, has all three kiyumim to it. Number one, you'll see in the language of the Aramaic, in Uvolet Zion, it's the Malachim. And they open up with V'atah Kadosh, V'kara zel ze v'yamar Kadosh Kadosh, U'mekablin dein mideh, V'amrinan Kaddish b'shmei Meroma, and they recite Kaddish up in the higher heavens. That's the Kedushas HaMalachim. But number two, it says in Uvolet Zion, Kaddish al Ara Ovad Gvurte. That Kaddish is the Kedushas Yisrael when the people of Israel recite Kedusha. And finally, it has the third element of uniting and integrating both the Kedusha of the Sarfei Mala together with the Kedusha of Kvutze Mata, of those mortal human beings. Li'olam u'olmei amayim. So we have first, in a sense, the solo Kedusha of the Malachim in Uvolet Zion. Then we go on to the solo Kedusha of Klal Yisrael, of human beings, of mortal man. And finally, reaching the apex, we integrate all this into a shlemus, a perfect whole. In that sense, the third Kedusha, the Kedusha de Sidra, as we call it, is the culmination of all the Kedushas. And I say the following, that 2 out of 3 of those Kedushas we can recite biyachid. And the first Kedusha that's initiated by the Malachim, for those, for example, who daven Basikin, perhaps that's the key moment that the Malachim initiate their Kedusha, and we sort of tag on. And the third Kedusha can certainly be recited biyachid. What we're missing is the middle Kedusha. And this is where I want to share with you 2 insights as to what we should be feeling, perhaps, when we're missing that middle Kedusha. The first insight that I have, Lefi Aniyas Daiti, is that perhaps there is a great entity, and there's no question in Tefillah, called the Tzibur towards Knesset Yisrael, and every single minyan is a microcosm of that great entity. And it's missing. But there's a pointer that emphasizes Tfilas HaYochid. In a certain sense, from one perspective, there's a certain one-up-it, I call it, on the Yachid over the Tzibur. Rav Soloveitchik often spoke about the fact that Al Pi Halacha, it's a Tosefta Trumos, we don't even sacrifice a Yachid for the sake of the entire Tzibur. What is, in a sense, unique and special that we can be happy about, we can be excited about when we daven as Yechidim without a Tzibur? Obviously, this is the will of God. But beyond that, where does a person find his own identity? If he's part of a tzibur, sometimes he identifies himself with the tzibur, and in a sense, what becomes secondary and is no longer primary is, how do I find myself? I'm in quarantine. Where do I find my identity when I can't be together with the tzibur? And here's where perhaps this experience of isolation puts a burden on our shoulders, that we have to find our self-fulfillment. We have to, in a sense, discover and reveal our own identity not as part of its tzibur. Forget about profession. Maybe we're not going to work in these days. Forgetting about financial dealings and success, perhaps. Forget about teaching in the academic sense, very limited. Forget about social interaction. There's some sort of virus that's microscopic that has completely undermined all of those human experiences and activities in which we identify with the tzibur, and those are gone. And now we have to ask ourselves, who are we? And can we find and discover our own religious identity in a very personal way? How do we find opportunities to grow as individuals? And that becomes a chovas yachid. I want to add another point, and this one is a little bit more somber as we daven b'yachidus. During this period of time, we are missing and longing for that kedusha, as we mentioned, the kedusha that's recited b'tzibur. It's fascinating to me, and I can't believe it's coincidental, that we are going through this experience during Sphira, during the counting period. You know, the story is told about a young child who is given by a parent a catalog of all the days of Sphira. And the child was meant to rip out a marker for each day as it passes, noting which day of the Sphira we're up to. So the child was very anxious to get to the number 49. So on the first night, he took out all the markers. I feel like that child, in a sense. When are we going to get back to the tzibur? We're 2 weeks away from Chag HaShavuos, Matan Torah. What is Matan Torah? What is Chag HaShavuos, if not the tzibur gathering together in the synagogue? And perhaps the excitement or the anticipation, maybe even the hope and the prayer that we can finally get back together for Chag HaShavuos, to be makabel the Torah as a community. Ki ish echad b'lev echad. Maybe that's what really, in a sense, motivates us to want to count the Sphira very quickly. It's no longer each day unto itself. It's like 49. Give it to me. I want to have it all. I'm waiting with great anticipation. And perhaps that's what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants of us. To actually feel longings and miss the tzibur, to miss the shul. Chazal tell us that the synagogue is a migdash ma'at. Where is our Beis HaMikdash? Right now, it's only the synagogue. And if we're missing that connection, then we're missing our Beis HaMikdash. So on the one hand, these are days, this is an experience which challenges us, as we said before, to define our own religious personal identity. And it's a great challenge. And on the other hand, perhaps HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to instill within us that longing, those, as we say in Hebrew, kisufim, longing for the ultimate day number 50 when we can finally get together as a tzibur. In that context, I would like to add perhaps another element to our tefillos when we daven as yechidim. And that's the concept of prayer on behalf of cholim. I have a list, which I'm not going to share with you right now, of all the cholim that I personally daven for. It's a pretty long list. And Rav Shechter, in one of the Corona tshuvos that he has, wonders about reciting tefillos on behalf of cholim on Shabbos and Yom Tov. Yontif in this context is Chag HaPesach. We'll have it again for the next round if the Cholim are not, Be'ez Hashem, they should all be well and healed. But if not, whether we could daven on behalf of these dangerously ill people, never on a Yontif. We have a principle that Tchina supplications are omitted on Shabbos and Yontif. I remember, just because you're all my buddies here, telling you a story. My wife was pregnant with our first child. We were living in Washington Heights in Manhattan, New York. And she had a very, very bad cough. I don't want to go into details about it. It was apparently set off by the pregnancy. I was desperate. Here I am, pretty much a young, married, newlywed almost, and my wife is pregnant, and I feel totally incapable of helping her in any way. So I run into the Breuer shul, and the Gabbai in Breuer says to me, "Is her life in danger?" You have to know the Ekis. By the Ekis, there's no such thing as a Misha Berach until after you're dead. I shouldn't say that. Until you're about to die. And I ran up to the Hasidic Stiebel on the other side of Bennett Avenue. They had no problem. And they said the Misha Berach. So if Shechter writes in this tshuva, it's a very short tshuva, he says that what we should do on Shabbos and Yontif, when typically we don't pray for Cholim, but in this dangerous period of time that we live in, he says that a tefillah for a Cholah can be inserted at the end of one's tefillah before he takes his 3 steps backwards. And quoting various sources, he says that although on Shabbos ein roy levakesh sheyisluchu refuah shlema min hashamayim, nachon, he writes, lispalel v'lomar, after he finishes Shmon Esrei, he should recite these prayers on behalf of the Cholim. And the proper place, he says, lahosif li'achar ha'mida li'achar yiyu l'ratzon refi. You remember, and this is based on the Gemara in Brachos, Daf Yud Zayin, that there are various tefillos that were added as tag-ons after we finish Shmon Esrei. So we recite yiyu l'ratzon refi, and in some sense, that officially terminates the Shmon Esrei, the Amidah, but we're still standing in front of the Ribono Shel Olam, and we still have the right to add something to that tefillah. And he says that's the point in which we are mispalel for divine mercy, as he calls it, for refuah shalema, for those who are ill. Very short tshuva, which you'll find in Rav Shechter's collection of Corona tshuvas. And therefore, I'm going to submit to you the following, that if we talk about the experience of Tfilas Yochid, and we mentioned some of the unique aspects of Tfilas Yochid, including those Kedushos that culminate with Uvolet Tzion, Kedusha the Sidra, we might add this element of Tfilah on behalf of the Cholim. And I feel for myself, again, just expressing my own personal experience, that 3 times a day, these are almost the highlights of my day, in a sense, when I pour out my heart asking for this long list of cholim. The list has unfortunately become shorter in the sense that a number of people, it's le'ilu nishmasam. On the other hand, there are a number of people on my list that are out of hospitals. They're on their way to recovery. They still have a long way to go. And this is like something that gives me life in my tefillos 3 times a day, even on Shabbos and Yontif. Rav Shechter in this context wants to know about someone who has recovered from the disease, and he wants to recite Birchas HaGomel. But it's impossible for him to get together a minyan for Tfilas Birchas HaGomel. And since we're all on Zoom now, he raises the question, can a person who had this salvation fulfill his obligation of Birchas HaGomel on Zoom? when there are 9 other people listening on Zoom. He opens up by quoting the Shulchan Aruch in Orach Chaim Reish Tes L'chatchila min Enoch Levarach Toshli Shlosha Yomim. The best time is to recite Birchas Hagol within 3 days of the salvation. But he says you can wait if you have to. Try to do it within 30 days. So you have that period of time up to 30 days. Then he writes, V'nirashim kvar higia yom chafhei. It's already 25 days since his recovery, and the Magefa Dayan Bimkomo Medes, he doesn't have too much time left, and you're not allowed to gather together 10 people for a minyan. He says, Yesh levarech derech Zoom. And I don't think that Rav Shechter owns any stocks in the company called Zoom. But he says that the reason you should be able to recite this bracha and biyotze on Zoom is because we have 2 separate categories in halacha requiring 10 people. One is called a davar shebekdusha, and a davar shebekdusha requires 10 people together. And then there's another halacha of 10 people, and that's called pirsum and hodah barabin, which means that God demands of you, the halacha demands of you to publicize your hodah, your thanksgiving, your gratitude to Hashem. And as long as there are 10 people to whom this salvation has become public, he says, Kol asar mechshivin derech Zoom. He also offers a telephone conference call. Is yatzu b'hachi sagi. That would be enough to fulfill his mitzvah. And he doesn't tell you exactly how he knows that the requirement of 10 in the case of Birchas HaGomel is not a davar shebekdusha, but rather it's a davar shebepirsum. He quotes.
So I think we spoke about this, but is it only males? So it's a minion of minion, right?
I don't know.
It's a minion just,
I'm not sure. He doesn't go into detail about that. If you'll give me another minute, Joe, I want to, I'm always looking for my contribution. I want to make my own contribution here. I just want to finish first with Rav Shechter. There's another 2 lines here. He writes that the Bir Halacha quotes Rav Kiveger that even if you hold that you're not Yotzi unless an Asura, he still says that Rashoy Levarech, you're allowed to make this bracha, even though it's absolutely critical that you have Asura. And in the case of Zoom, he says that he can fulfill his requirement, even if it's critical, if it's absolutely kuva, by Zoom, because we're not talking about a davar shebekdusha. So, for example, a minyan is required for Kriyas HaTorah, that's already a davar shebekdusha. Azoras Hashatz and Kedusha require a minyan, and they have to be gathered together in one place. Rav Shechter is not a big fan of all sorts of porch minyanim and so forth and so on. Other poskim are making, but he's not on that page. But he says Birkas HaGomel, there the requirement of a minyan and its goal is simply pirsum. It's to publicize the miracle. And therefore you can have 10 people listening even if they're not in the same room. So where does Berzon want to add something? There's a Gemara in Masechta Ksubis that deals with what's called Birchas Chasanim, which, as you know, the Chasan recites for the 7 days of his marriage anytime there's a gathering of 10 people during the Shivas Yimei HaMishteh. The Gemara says that you need a minyan of 10. And the Gemara derives this from a pasuk in Tehillim b'makelos birchu Hashem, that in a kahal, a person has to thank Hashem, and that's the case of the Chasan who thanks Hashem for having found his mate for him. He, with the capital H, found a mate for him, a small h, for the Chasan. The Gemara then wavers back and forth about whether or not Chasan atzmo min minyan, and the Chasan himself be included in the minyan. And the Gemara quotes a pasuk in Rus by Boaz, Vayikach asora miziknei ha'ir, and it says that after he, in the presence of 10 of the Zkanim, he got the okay from them to marry Rus, and that's based on the drasha Moavi v'lo Moaviyah. Then it says Vayivarchu also, and then they blessed him, and Chazal identify that blessing as Sheva brachas. So it happened that number one, he got the okay from the 10 Zkanim, then he married Rus, and then he got the bracha from the 10 Zkanim. So the Gemara says, why did he have to gather 10 Zkanim? Why couldn't he just gather 9 Zkanim? The pasuk says, Asora meziknei hamokom. So this is a proof that the chassan himself is not part of the minyan. So I wanted to suggest that there are 2 different sources for Sheva brachas. One is b'makelos, Bircha Hashem, and the other is Vayikach Boaz Asara Noshim. If we say b'makelos, that his bracha, his recitation has to be in a kol, then he's not less part of the kol than anyone else. But if we assume that his obligation is to publicize the fact that Hashem did this great miracle for him, Kikriyas Yamsuf, and brought him his bat zug, then he can't publicize it to himself. He's got to publicize it to another 10 people. And therefore Boaz had to gather together not 9 people, but 10 people. Because it was no news to him, it was news to them. And based on this sugya, we paskin in Shulchan Aruch that Birkas HaGomel, like Birkas Chasana, requires a minyan. And I'd like to add a kula and a chumrah. A kula, if we're comparing it to Boaz, would be that all you need is pirsu. It's not a davar shebekdusha, it's not a chiyuv kahal, and therefore zoom, as Rav Shechter points out, would be appropriate. The chumrah of it is that it's not enough to invite 9 people into your Zoom. You have to invite 10 people in your Zoom in order to make the mitzvah of pirsu. Now, I want to thank David for, circulating some of these pieces. I want to talk about, if you got it, hopefully Kedima Matzolos Nefashos. But first, let's take a look at a few of the points that are made in that attachment that I gave you, specifically on pages 5 and 6, if you have those pages. And this is from questions and answers during Corona to Rabbi Willick Shlita. And one question is, how to maintain a maximum of social distancing during Kriyas HaTorah? On the one hand, if Willig often says, don't ask me questions about Kriyas HaTorah till it's relevant. But on the other hand, we now have minyanim that are okay outside. Again, I'm not sure if you have that in Canada. If anyone could tell me, we have it here in Yerushalayim. Are we up to that Madrega in Canada? Not yet. Shake your head if you do have outdoor minyanim in Canada.
Not yet.
In some places, yes.
Oh, you do? Okay, so for example, I participate daily in a minyan, which is very close to here, out on Katz and Ellenbogen Street, if you're familiar with it. And they read the Torah. And is there a way of minimizing, so to speak, the danger? Because you have the person who takes out the Sefer Torah and puts it down on the shulchan. You have the Balkore, and then you have, the Olim, and on Shabbos it's going to be 7 Olim plus Maftir, and they're all crowding around the Sefer Torah, the Ola, and the Kabal Kore, etc., etc. So Willig writes that one person should go up to the Sefer Torah. He should get all the aliyos. He should also be the one to take the Sefer Torah out. In the Sephardic community, that's called Ptichat HaHeichal, which is considered like, when they auction it off, the Sephardim will pay endless amount of money for for Ptichat HaEchal, and he's the same person who does Hagba. He's the same person who will place the Sefer Torah on the table. He's going to do Galila. He's going to put it back into the Aron Kodesh. But, says Rav Willig, for each Aliyah, he should recite 2 brachos. Now, on the one hand, I'm clapping because Kol HaKavod, on 2 levels. First of all, Rav Willig is now realizing that these questions are halacha l'maisa, and he can't shrug them off. He's got a paskin. And that gives, I give him credit for that. But on the other hand, I give him credit because, in a sense, he's breaking new ground. And he's saying that we no longer need 7 olim, nor do we have to have one person who's taking out the Sefer Torah and another person who's putting it back, or if the same, or somebody else is doing Hag with Lila, etc., etc. And it becomes now a one-man show. Obviously, that's going to limit, the need for social distancing. What I find to be a pella is that the one person gets an aliyah, and one aliyah after the other, and he recites 2 new brachos on each one of those aliyahs. I don't understand why that has to be. The Gemara tells us in Masechta Megillah that the numbers of olim correspond to either Kohanim, Yisraelim, and Levim. That's number 3 on Mondays and Thursdays, or perhaps Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, and Ksuvim. Whatever it is, then there's 7, and each number has its own significance. And I think Rav Willig is telling us that that significance will require that we separate one aliyah from the other and get 7 olim.
Would he also say that you should give it to a Kohen?
He doesn't mention that because I think he's feeling that this person is getting all the kibudim. There's halacha that if you have 2 people, then the first one should be a Kohen, that's for Kidashto. But if there's only one person, then there's no halacha of a Kidashto. Now, I thought that maybe we could get a clue about this from a different issue, which Baruch Hashem, again, the poskim are now open to deal with, and that is when we resume in Mirz Hashem Kriyas HaTorah, we're speeding up the counting for that day. How many kriyos can we make up from the kriyos that we missed? And here we have a tshuva, which I don't remember which tshuvas you have in front of you, but it's called Kriyas HaTorah b'Shabbos Achar HaMagefa. And he quotes a Shar Ephraim that if they were mevatel many, many kriyos, if it's a case of ones, it wasn't, a bittul hakriya beratzon, so then they could make it up in the next Shabbos. And not only that, if there were many Shabbosos that they missed Kriyas HaTorah, then what do you do? And the Shar Ephraim says, Ein likros kol mashad bitlu, rakorin haseder shal Shabbos shal afanav, im seder shal Shabbos. You can only make up the last Shabbos that you missed. Umisha rotza linog v'likros mashad bitlo Shabbos shel mechubarim or bitl kama Shabbosos. Ein maznichin also. He says, I'm not going to reject someone who decides, or the Kehillah decides, that we want to make up many Shabbosos. So we see that even the Shar Ephraim, who doesn't require a hashlama more than one parsha, nevertheless, he's okay. He doesn't advocate or recommend it, but he's okay with the idea of adding many kriyos and being mashlim a number of Shabbosos. And the Mishnah Brura mentions this Shar Ephraim, and so forth and so on. Now, there's a Magen Avraham, and the Magen Avraham says that Le'inyan Yosem mi Sidros, we could be Mekil, and we could read more than that one Sidra, but 2 Sidros, etc. And every base Knesset will decide whether they will rely on the Shafraim and just make up the last Shabbos, or they want to somehow make up many Shabbosos. You get the impression that the Magen Avram might be in favor of making up all the Shabbosos that the Tzibur missed. But then, in the case of Shabbos, are you allowed to be Mosif? Now, we've been discussing the case of Shabbos. With regard to Shabbos, there's a lot more flexibility about Kriyas HaTorah, because there's such a concept called Hosafa. During a Monday or a Thursday davening, Hosafa is almost impossible. But let's say a shul decides on Shabbosim that they want to add and make up for missing parshios. They're allowed to do so. How should they do so? So if Shechter presents two approaches based on a whole variety of sources. He says, if the congregation wishes, they could read all the missing parshios on that Shabbos when they return to shul. They finish the 7 aliyos of that Kriyas HaTorah for that Shabbos, and then they should take out a second Sefer Torah. We'll see soon that you can take out both Sefer Torah from the get-go, and they could read all of the missing laning in one session. And he goes on to say that if that's too burdensome on one particular Shabbos, then the Kahal can divide up the missed parshios into multiple weeks. Each week, when they come back to shul, 2 Sifrei Torah will be taken out. The first Torah for the 7 aliyahs of that week's parsha, the second Torah to be used entirely for those missing parshas. And when they make up the parsha, then after the makeup is gone, they read the Haftorah of that week's parsha. So you have A, B, and C. You have A, the 7 aliyos that cover the entire parsha Shavua. B, in the second Sefer Torah, they're making up as many parshas as they feel is not too burdensome on the community. And then they read the Haftorah after they finish the makeup kriyos. So after the reading from the first Sefer Torah is complete, then we place the second Sefer Torah on the shulchan. Kaddish, meaning Chatzi Kaddish, will complete the kriya of that week, and then we call it Maftir. Maftir is going to be called up from the second Sefer Torah. He's going to read from the second Sefer Torah. All the Mekel Parshios, as we said before, is not too burdensome to read. So if Shechter, in a certain sense, in his tshuva, has institutionalized the possibility of a Kriyas HaTorah after the Magefa that will cover not just that week's parsha, but parshas that we missed. My impression is, and I don't know why he doesn't mention this, that the Seder, if they can't fit in all the parshas, should be the last parsha first. Whenever we do Tashlumin, we always start with the Tashlumin for the last parsha. So if, let's say, this week's parsha is going to be Bahar B'Chukosai here in Eretz Yisrael, last week's parsha was Emor, they would recite Emor, and if they can't add to it, Achri Mos Kedoshim, then they'll wait to another week, and then they'll do Achri Mos Kedoshim. But Emor should come first. Now he talks about a bar mitzvah boy who couldn't read the parsha that he had prepared.
Quick question.
One second, I just want to get the whole picture. So he says that in the case of bar mitzvah boy, he's prepared a certain parsha, you can't expect him to make up another parsha and prepare it. He says that we're going to call on the bar mitzvah boy to read that missing parsha. He's going to have to, though, recite the Haftorah on a different Shabbos, or on that same Shabbos from that Parshas HaShavua. So we're going to take out two Sifrei Torah. We're going to read the regular parsha from the first, second Sefer Torah is the Mis Parsha, and we're going to allow the bar mitzvah boy in this particular case to read from the second Sefer Torah the parsha that he missed, which means that we're going to kill two birds with one stone. On the one hand, since the Sibur missed that parsha, we're going to have a makeup for that parsha that was missed, and we go with the kula of the Sharfraim who allows such a thing to go on, and we're going to kill another stone. We're going to allow the bar mitzvah boy to get his glory by reading the parsha that he prepared. And then Rav Shechter writes that the practice is that the Haftorah is going to be read after the last Sefer Torah. He's going to be in the following bind, so to speak. Which Haftorah is he going to read? So on the one hand, in all these cases of Ashlama, we're going to read the Haftorah of that Sedra. But in this particular case, Rav Shechter says that since he is doing the Ashlama and he's reading from the second Sefer Torah, his parasha, we're going to allow him to proceed and read the Haftorah that he prepared for his Haftorah, for his bar mitzvah, because that is now going to be attached to the immediate kriya that he's completing in the second Sefer Torah. An amazing kula of Rav Shechter. And once again, I'm not exactly clear how he knows this, but you're all invited to read the tshuva. Okay, then? Joe, you want to say something?
I was wondering if he would say this is only on Shabbos, but let's say our first
Only
time
on Shabbos.
back. I'm saying let's say our first time back is Yom Tov. He would say for sure not.
Yeah, only on Shabbos. Somebody else want to make a comment? Okay. Now, getting back to Rav Willig, and I have a tshuva here from Rav Usher Zelig Weiss. I tried to forward it to you. I don't know, my technological skills are a little bit limited here, so I wasn't able to get it from my WhatsApp over to anyone else's WhatsApp. Every time I pressed, forward, I don't know, it just... And these are all issues that we touched upon last week about reimbursements. So one of the things we discussed last week was a young 19-year-old who came back from his second year in yeshiva, but he came back Purim time, and he gets a check from the American government because he's out of work. And if you remember, his situation was that he only worked once in his life at a summer camp as a counselor, and he had a total salary of $600, and he's getting a check from the American government for $1,200. And the question is whether he has to return that money. He's a big tzaddik for asking this child. I'm so fascinated by those who ask the question. And Rav Willig points out that if the government sees that legally he has rights to this money, he doesn't have to give it back. But what happens in the case of someone who wants to get back money because, for example, he can no longer live in an apartment? Let's say he has rental in an apartment. He had to run away because of the Magefa, and he ran to America. He's not living in the house anymore. He has a case of a kollel that rented the premises of the kollel for a period of months, and the kollel is no longer in session because of the Magefa. They're not using the premises. Are they obligated to pay rent? So these are a number of financial issues that come up. Rav Willig writes, I cannot answer financial questions when I'm only listening to one side. Now, I personally know one of the great poskim here in Yerushalayim, in Dinei Momenos, and he's a dayan, I know him pretty well because his son is married to my daughter. And he's related to the Kanner Mishpacha in Toronto. In any event, he will answer questions, but he'll tell you that the questions that he's answering are based on the information you give him. You know, he give you the halachic guidance, but it's not a full psak. Rav Willig doesn't even want to touch it. He doesn't want to answer the question on the whole of the kollel is asking what is their financial obligation towards paying rent when they really clinched this contract for the purpose of davening and learning on premises, none of which they're doing now. And Rav Willig refuses to answer the question because he doesn't want to deal with Dini Momenos. And in his answer, when he pushes off the Shoel, he writes, I'm only interested in Dinei Nefashos. So I looked at the very next question on this list of questions that was given to Rav Shechter, to Rav Willig, and I figured for sure this is going to be a Dinei Nefashos question because Rav Willig does answer the question. And he wants to know about a woman, a mother, who has a 12-year-old son, and they're both in isolation. There's no adult male to recite Havdalah for them. Who should recite Havdalah? The son or the mother? The mother's not sure whether she's obligated in Havdalah. That's a Sufik Doraisa. And on the other hand, the son has a potential chiyuv. Maybe he should recite Havdalah. So if Willig says no, the woman should recite Havdalah. So apparently Rav Shechter does answer questions that are not Dinei Nefashos. So I don't know how to put these two things together. You'll see them on your page. There are two questions that come one after the other. In any event, I wanted to share with you the insights of Rav Osher Zelig Weiss, because I think that his response to this question goes way beyond and reveals something that I thought was a secret in Dinei Choshe Mishpat in monetary laws. Be'inyan b'nei chutzlaretz, shenivtzar mehem, it's impossible for them lachzor la'aretz, they can't come back to Eretz Yisrael based on the laws of the state. Ha'im tzrichim em l'shalem schar dira maleh, do they have to pay a full rental fee for whatever they rented in Eretz Yisrael in this case? Oh, Shema yesh biyodam lahafchis mischar hadira mishum shemedubar b'makas medina, meaning that the law changes in a case of makas medina. If a person, for whatever reason, is not availing himself and enjoying the benefits of dira in a case where he signed a rental agreement, he has to pay for that rental agreement by virtue of contract. But the only exception to that rule is called Makas Medina. And the Gemara tells us that in case of Makas Medina, he doesn't have to pay the full rental. And here's where Rav Osher Zelig Weiss reveals a secret, which I don't know if it's published anywhere. He says, B'didei Mamanos, in monetary law, Hamiyuchad, what's very special about monetary law is li'olam, you will never find tshuva mefureshet. In other words, in Arachaim, for example, you want to know whether you put on your tefillin on the left arm or on the right arm, so you'll get a clear-cut answer. But in Dini Mamanos, he says, Kshashelot mitorot b'chai hamaisa, li'olam, yesh makom lefakpek shema ein anido domen legamri l'raya. In other words, you could quote a tshuva, and you think that the tshuva is addressing a situation, a scenario, which is identical to the one that you're answering, that you're addressing, and it's never identical. There are always nuances of differences that could be relevant. And the whole concept of what we call precedent law, which you compare your case to a previous case, is very, very tenuous when it comes to Dinei Momenos. He has a tshuva from the Maram Padova back in Italy from many, many centuries ago, in a case where there's a very similar equation between analogy between what's going on now and what took place many, many centuries before. And the Maram Padova quotes a machlokes between Rabbeinu Kalman and Rabbeinu Zalman in the case of Ruvain, who rented a store from Shimon. He wanted to use the store in order to go into the loan business, to extend loans. He was a money changer, but there was Zeros HaMoshel, and the government decided that this kind of business is not going to go on. And basically the government shut him down. And he's the socher, he's the one who signed an agreement to rent out this chanut. And the question is this called Makas Medina? And therefore Ruvain has the right to diminish the schar that he would pay for the deer. Again, you have to know all the details, how much you're allowed to diminish. O Shema, yesh biyodo al yidei tircha v'tachbul laharim al shiltonos. And the machlokis between this Rabbeinu Kalman and Rabbeinu Zalman is maybe this is not called Makas Bindina. Why? Because there are ways of finagling, if I could use that word. There are ways of bitachbula, if he works very hard, that he can utilize the premises for his purpose without putting his life into danger or getting thrown into jail. And basically, the machlokis goes on in that tshuva of the Maram Parva about whether we should consider this Makas Medina or not, because how much can we demand of this person, the socher, to put himself all out and go ahead and somehow be mitparnes min ha'esek? Or shall we say, no, it's very, very impossible for him to do so. It's too much of a tircha for various reasons, and therefore it's not called Makas Medina. And Rav Weiss therefore formulates the following principle: B'chol she'elos kein elu, in any question like this one, bi'olam lo titochen hachra brura umuchletes. You can never really come to a definite conclusion. And therefore, listen carefully, ala posek, lishkol es advarim bepeles, kasher shnei arochim ner l'ragl. The responsibility of the posek is to juggle the following two goals. The first goal is midas hayosher ve'hachemla, meaning to be honest and straight and yet compassionate. And the second one is seichel hayosher, to use his own logical analysis. Therefore, he says, Rav Weiss, in our situation, we don't have a clear-cut source, neither in Shas nor in Poskim, to explain, well, I should say not to explain, but rather to determine with total reliance that we could be kover what the halacha is regarding those who left Eretz Yisrael, went to Chutz La'aretz, and they're afraid to come back. We cannot come to any definite conclusion. There are so many different factors. If they're rented, let's say, I'm just thinking out loud, the Mir Yeshiva. I don't know if anybody knows what goes on in the Mir Yeshiva. There are all sorts of diros, surrounding the Mir Yeshiva that are rented by thousands of students, and I'm not exaggerating. And he says that in every shchuna they might have different rules as to who's allowed to come and who's allowed to live and how we can receive him. And he says if he comes back to Eretz Yisrael, then according to the Israeli law, he's got to stay in quarantine. Now this is outdated. He writes Bimlonot. They closed all those hotels, but they used to have hotels for quarantine, for 14 days of quarantine. I'm not sure if that's the greatest deal in the world. I mean, it sounds like a great deal because you don't have to pay for that hotel. But I'm not going to go into detail, but different things have happened. And it's, again, I'm going to deny if I ever quoted it, how safe this is to go to those hotels. But anyway, shall we say that situation is like another situation called Yaveh Shamayan. So, for example, I rented from you with a contract a certain mill that's run by a mayan. In other words, the spring water runs the mill. And if it's Yaveh Shamayan, then the Gemara says he still has to pay rental. Why? Because Efshal Lahavi Mayim min anar bidliim. He would have to schlep all the way over to the Nar in order to accumulate enough water by hand without the flowing water of the Mayim B'tircha Gedola. And nevertheless, since it's possible, the Gemara says, Eino menakim mischaro. He's not allowed to reduce the rental fee. So maybe 14 days in quarantine should be compared to the case of schlepping out to the Nar to bring this water with water carriers. And therefore, B'kol she'elos kayotze bazeh, ala posek, every posek has to know what's going on in his neighborhood. The lifsok lefi das, that was the first element that we spoke about, seichel hayosha lefi shikol hadas. Ulam, but he has to also add chemla. He's got to add an element of compassion. Now again, as we discussed last week, I'm not sure which way the compassion goes. You know, think about the person who makes a livelihood by renting out his apartment. He's not finding another renter. Think about the yeshiva bacher who pays rent and he can't enjoy any benefit from the rent. Or shall we say that since he can perhaps b'tircha gedola return to Eretz Yisrael, therefore it's like the case of Yaveh Shamayan. And he writes that there are shchunot where almost all the apartments in that area, he gives the example of Ramat Eshkol, are rented out to young couples from Chutz La'aretz that, you know, the husband is learning in yeshiva in Kolel, and already before Pesach, they all packed out. He says, Lo savir klal sheyeh biyad hamaskirim lahaskir osam lacherim. There's no way that the owners of these apartments are going to find anyone else at this point. And he says, therefore, it's a situation, again, he goes into details here, which I'm trying to, the Sefse Muat is Yesh Lefasher. He says we have to find some sort of a theorem that's a pshara. Ulahamid es aschiris al machtzisa. He recommends that, again, each case is different, but he should be paying half of the rental. But he says that this only applies to the Tchilas Mana Kayitz, Lifnei Tchilas Chodesh Iyar, Shezeh Zman Shebiyom Ketikunam, Sochrei Hadiros Hayuchozrim Arza, Lulei Hamagefa. He says that, you know, we get to a date in which we can assume that if it would have been a normal year, all these couples would have returned. Uledaiti al uvda sheyesh biyad b'nei chutz la'aretz al pi ishur miyuchad lachzor v'lishos b'melonis. He says that's a tirchi yisera, and he says to go into a Corona hotel, as we call it, that's even beyond the case of taking a delete, you know, to personally, physically carry the water. He doesn't explain why that's worse. And then he goes on to say that whatever he wrote is only valid until we see what the future brings. But he finishes up by saying, Yosef Mizeh Shalafaret, we can't go into greater details. You know, you should use these general guidelines. Rabbonei Akihilos, Vashchunos, Yishkalu es advarim lefi matzav hamakomos b'megureihem. And he says that the Rabbonim have to decide according to what goes on in their neighborhoods, and it could change from one neighborhood to the other. Rav Willig has a question here about a person who decides that he wants to recite Morid Atal and adopt that minhag. I mean, I don't understand exactly, Nachi is a Talmud of mine, but I'm not sure exactly why there would be an issue about that. But then he asks what happens if he starts reciting Morid Atal, which is, by the way, the minhag Agra also, and then he forgot to say it. So since he changed his psak, now maybe it's an integral part of Shmon Esrei. I don't know why that's a question either, because even for anyone who says Moed Atal, if he omits it, he doesn't go back. Okay. Now, I want to discuss with you how we're doing on the clock. Okay, for those who have to go, obviously go, but I just want to add another very important tshuva here. And that's from Rav Shechter. And again, thank you to David for sending this out. And this is called Priorities in Hatzolas Nefashos. 2 cholim come into the hospital at the same time. There's only one ventilator. To whom should we allot the ventilator? Again, I'm not sure if the poskim are going to make that decision for the hospital. Although I have to tell you that amongst ethical issues in some hospitals in Chutz La'aretz, they do want to know, the position of various rabbis and different religious religious leaders. But in any event, let's say you're running a hospital like Shaarei Tzedek or perhaps Laniado or other possibilities here in Israel, maybe in Chutz La'aretz. I don't know if there are any possibilities where the triage decision has to be made according to Allah. He says, "Im li echad shekarv levade she'efshal atzilo, ulesheni rak safek im yoel, pshita she'ein dochin vadai mipnei safek." Fascinating. We have a principle in halacha in many places. Ein safek motzi b'dei vadai. Vadai is kavua. That has the chazaka. And a suffix is not powerful enough to remove from a vadai. If we know in this particular scenario that one of them will definitely survive, which again, it's very hard to determine that in our situation. But let's say the second one, we don't know if he'll survive or not. We don't even know if the ventilator will help him or not. In such a case, then ein safek motzi midei vadai. We will certainly designate the ventilator for that person who is he's in the parsha, so to speak. We can hope that he'll survive. Or maybe I should say we assume that he'll survive. It's interesting that as a source, he quotes the Nishmas Avram. And Nishmas Avram is a physician here in Eretz Yisrael, Rabbi Avram Steimer, and he paskins a lot. I mean, I have one volume. I think he has many volumes on medical ethics. The first chola came, and they already attached him to the ventilator. He's a very old person, and he's sick. But it's a suffix im yoyelo atipul. We don't know if that ventilator will hurt him. Abba Achra, the second one, has a very good chance because he's got a clean record except for corona. He's bari vitzar and he's young. Ein dochin nefesh b'tnei nefesh. There's no way that we could remove the ventilator from the zaken muflag v'chola for the sake of the bari vitzar. Achen, im b'shah sheba hazaken hamesukan tchila. Kfar yodim mirosh shebaod sha'a shatayim yaviu lebeit hacholim od cholim tzeirim briim ki kach korei b'chol yom uborer adover she'ein maspik ventilators avur kol hacholim. Now watch this scenario. Reuven comes in. He's never an alta yid. He's a cranky yid. And we know that they're going to bring younger people who have a better chance within an hour or 2 hours, because that's what's going on a regular basis. And we also know that we don't have enough ventilators to go around. Nira, the afbozer bibchinas bo bevasachas. The ein lanu lechaber lechatchilas hazokin hamuflag hamesugon lamach. Whoa, this defies my understanding. Imagine we can withhold the treatment of a ventilator because we know that someone else is coming. This reminds me, again, I'm not sure if my analogy is correct, of the famous issue about fasting on Tzom Gedalia. We have someone who the Rofim say he could fast on Tzom Gedalia, but if he does so, he'll be too weak to fast on Yom Kippur. And again, the poskim go back and forth, but the final halacha is that he will fast on Tzom Gedalia. Today is Tzom Gedalia, it's the 3rd of Tishrei, and that's when he's going to fast. The halacha doesn't have to concern itself with what's going on down the line. And this is called Davar Be'ito. This is called a mitzvah bali yadcha. You can't postpone that mitzvah. There's a choleh who's b'sakana now, and you yourself admit that once he's attached to the ventilator, is ein dochin nefesh b'fnei nefesh. We're not allowed to disconnect that ventilator. But you're saying no, it's bo b'vasachas. Why? Because we know that someone's coming. Yeah, but when is he coming in? He's not here. I look to the left, I look to the right. And unfortunately, Rav Shechter doesn't tell us where he got this from. So in my mind, this is a pella of a chiddush. Now he wants to know about the law of Kedima. This is a Mishnah at the end of Masechtas Horios. And the halacha is that if you have a choice of Hatzalah and it's triage, who comes first? And the Gon in Yoredea, when he paskins these halachas, he quotes Yerushalmi in Horios. And it seems that he concludes that Makdimim lahatzil, if all things otherwise are equal, es mi shahakehila sricha lo bioseh. You have two people. One plays a very crucial role in the community. He gets kedima because we're going to save him on behalf of the community. He really keeps the community up. Rav Moshe Feinstein in a tshuva says that Lamaisa, it's very difficult to implement the rules of the Mishnah in Horios, because go figure out who is more critical to the community. He gives an example of a man and a woman, both need Hatzalah, and usually if all things are equal, the Ish, because he's chayav in all the mitzvahs, he comes first, not because a man is superior to a woman, but for the sake of the Taryag mitzvahs, a woman is exempt from many mitzvahs, mitzvah seishas man grama. But he writes bismanenu. How do you apply this today when there are many women who are dedicated to the study of Torah, to doing mitzvahs, even more than men, and many of them are playing an important role in the community? Very difficult. Rav Moshe says it's almost as if the determining halacha here is theoretical and we don't know how to apply it. V'din zeh kosher likva mi nitzrach l'kehila yoser mimi. Who is needed for the kehila more than someone else? Umitam zeh makubal eitzah poskim so linog al pi klolei Mishnah. Unbelievable. How many opportunities do we have where the poskim, how many occasions the poskim say, well, there's a Mishnah. Nobody debates the Mishnah. There's no machlokas against the Mishnah. And we don't follow the Mishnah. We're going to follow the final decision of the poskim. And he says, when we talk about a Zaken Muflag, who's Mesukon, right? This elderly Jew is in a very dangerous situation. And we have on the other hand, it's Sa'ir, a younger person who is relatively healthy, except that he has corona. He says, Narviach Yoser Netapel Bitsar Abari. If we apply Rav Moshe's standards, then in this case it becomes really clear that we should give first precedence to the Tzar HaBari, because he's going to serve the community for the rest of his life if only we save him. And he says we should not define this as counting years. That this, muflog he's gonna die within 5 years, 10 years. That's all he has left to his life. Whereas the Tsar will live for another 50 years. He says, no. We don't know how long a person is going to live. We can never determine that. But rather, kavana bazeh sheisal hazakin achole afilu im yoel lo a ventilator rak yichye shah chai shah. Now, Rav Shechter says that in the case of this chole, who's a zaken muflog, he says the maximum amount of time that he'll live if he gets, shall we say, saved by the ventilator, is less than 12 months. Again, that's the scenario that he's addressing. I don't know, honestly, if the medical professionals can determine that, but let's assume they can. But however, in the case of the ventilator, for the Tzar HaBari, that's called Chai Olam. Chai Olam means he'll live beyond the year. Less than a year is already called a treifa. Upshita dezeh cheshbon al pidin shechai olam dochim chai shah v'lachen yesh lakdimo. Again, according to Rav Shechter, yesh lakdimo means two things. It means if we have two cholim in front of us that came simultaneously, and it also means if we know that this zaken muflag is going to be followed in a couple of hours by a tzayer bari. And we're going to withhold that one ventilator that we have until the tzayer comes along. Because that's Chai Shah and that's Chai Olam. The zaken muflag, we can only give him up to 12 months. Again, how do you know that? Don't ask me any questions. Nire, his final conclusion. Kfar chibru es hazaken hamuflag leventilator, v'achach hevinu, they understood that they made a mistake, shaloya kedai, because harbe tzeirim yavo od. Again, and before I read the next part, because I want you to make sure you're holding on to your chairs here, what would you say about the following? Based on everything Rav Shechter said, if they already attached the, I don't think the word attached is the right word, but anyway, they hooked up the ventilator to the zaken muflog, and now they realize we made a big mistake. We have no way of getting another ventilator for the tzoyer that's going to come in an hour or two. What would have been your guess if you were writing the tshuva based on whatever Rav Shechter said before? Anybody want to volunteer for that? I mean, you'd have to unmute yourself. Nobody. And again, I'll just tell you what I would have said. I've said, all right, they made a mistake, but he's on the ventilator. You can't take him off the ventilator. Says Rav Shechter, Min hanochon sharofim kovim al zaken zeh hachlata shel DNR. Do not resuscitate. Ki legabe hascholas hatipul achadash avur achole benigud letipul batzeirim zekvar nechshav kibol vasachas. In other words, if you get to a point where you're actively trying to save the life of the zaken muflag chole, and you realize that you have to do more in order to save him and actively involved, then he says DNR, which, if I understand correctly, means passive. Now we're not going to actively try to save this man's life. And again, I'm reading between the lines, he's going to die. And why are we going to let him die? Because if the Tzeirim Briam would have been there at the time that we hooked them up to the ventilator, they would have gotten the ventilator, one of them. The aim was there, mishumein dochin nefesh b'fnei nefesh, ki ein kan ritzicha b'kum v'aseh. If we withhold treatment, that's not called murder in the active sense. Rak ikium hatzola. We're just not fulfilling the mitzvah of hatzola, of saving the zoken, which is considered a mitzvah based on lo saman al tamriyecha. And therefore, we should issue a DNR ruling, or whatever the word I'm looking for is, and based on that decision, we're going to be able to free up that ventile for the sake of the soil. I mean, I'm almost ready to cry here because, I mean, the issues. I mean, I'm not sure that we saw this in Israel because I think we have enough ventilators, but from what I hear about, especially New York City, I don't know all the gory details, but I heard also about Britain, the horrible, horrible stories of life and death. But because of DNR, and that's only because of the Tzi'irim that we know they're going to come, we're going to be able to free up this mental. Don't worry, says Rav Shechter. That's not called Ritzicha. We're just not going to go ahead and try to save it. Rabbi said, okay, I think it's late. I want to thank everyone for coming. And I'm not going to mention any names here, but special thanks to two people who are here with me today who convinced me to go on Zoom when they said that it wasn't working for them with 8x8. Those who know who I mean, so you'll accept my thanks. And I think the Zoom is working for us. I'll be honest with you, I thought of reciting Birchas HaGomel on Zoom because I too was a corona patient, but I never a patient. I never had any symptoms. In fact, I felt better than I ever did. Now, why did I test positive over and over again if I don't feel any symptoms? That's where this coronavirus really sort of eludes medical knowledge. We still don't know enough about it. In fact, now that I have 3 negatives, and I ask myself, well, you know, are there any chashashot that I could get sick again? I can't get an answer to that either. They have this concept called mutations, and they don't know about the immunity system, and a million and one doubts about it. But I feel that to say Hagoma, you need to be actually in a life-threatening situation, and we see Baruch Hashem. I don't know the statistics in Chutzlars, but I know here a relatively, I mean, unfortunately, a significant percentage, but a relatively minor percentage of people were actually in sakana. In New York, I can just tell you from my immediate family, my wife's immediate family, how many members of our immediate family were in sakana. And those who survived certainly have to recite Hagomel, and according to Czech, they can do it on Zoom. Okay, then. So let me just sign off here, and if you're available for different Chumash classes tomorrow night, I'm scheduled to give a Chumash class at 9 o'clock on Zoom, and you'll see the link in the email. And Mirza Shem, another Chumash class on Friday at I believe is 9:30. If I'm not mistaken, you'll double check me on that. And at this point, I'll sign off and thank you all for joining me. I hope you got something out of the shir.